Now, from a soprano being judged on her body weight to a Facebook page entirely dedicated to women eating on the tube. Are these just annoying one-off incidents or examples of everyday sexism? In London, where you might expect the whole sexism debate to be a thing of the past, there are some who argue it's everywhere and women have to take on a zero-tolerance approach before true equal rights will ever be established. Alison Earle went out to ask men and women in London about their experiences of subtle sexism.
I haven't experienced much sexism recently in the UK. Everything seems quite fair for me. I've experienced it in other countries, but I think fortunately here in the UK it's dying out, which is a good thing.
I've had some comments thrown at me, yeah. I've had, like, you should be in the kitchen doing this, but, you know, that's expected at work, but...
You know, it's always nice for somebody to say that, you know, that a man bum looks nice or whatever it is, right? That's what we get in the office, but at the same time, it's, you know, you do get sexism that's kind of bad, so you get, you know, men that are not physically very strong, they can't pick stuff up. Women, they make snide remarks sometimes, stuff like that. I mean, if that was on the other foot, the woman wouldn't really like that sort of thing.
I try not to overthink it too much. If someone calls me love, then I don't particularly mind. I don't think they're trying to be sexist. It's like one of those things when men offer you seats on the tube, even though you might not be pregnant or carrying things, and it's just a nice gesture to do to, like, another human being.
Right, now here to talk about sexism in the capital are Daisy Buchanan. She's a columnist for The Guardian. Mike Buchanan, no relation, founder of Justice for Men and Boys and the Alternative Sexism Project. And Dina Rickman, who's one of the London Live 3 who comments on issues affecting young Londoners. Now, Daisy, what do you think the issues are in terms of just the daily, everyday experiences of sexism? You know, one of those people in the Voxes said if someone calls her love, she doesn't mind that.
I think the trouble with this is that it's quite easy to get to a point where you never experience it and you do think, no, there are no problems, it's fine now, we're evolved beyond this. And then it does suddenly and dramatically hit you, and it can be one horrible incident or a few little instances. Something that I think is really interesting is in her book, How to Be a Woman, Kat Moran talks about the idea of bringing a broken windows policy to feminism, and that you have to kind of fight the small stuff. You can't just wait for it to amass and amass and amass before it becomes a bigger problem. But yeah, I've had, you know, if a man in a shop or anyone in a shop calls me love, women call me love, I don't think that is part of the problem. I call men being called love too, but... OK,
so you're saying the bigger issues. Have you experienced the big issue of sexism where you think that you were treated badly just because you were a woman?
I've frequently had sexual abuse shouted at me from cars. I've often been afraid to get the tube home at night. Every single one of my friends has experienced a mugging or a fear after the awful, awful instance of the weekend.
Sexual abuse shouted at you?
Yes. So, I mean, not anything I can say at lunchtime on the television, but yes, very kind of obscene suggestions. The last time was about a week ago, and it was broad daylight. I was walking through Canary Wharf, busy road. Some men beckoned me over to their car, and I assumed that they wanted directions, so in good faith I went over to help, but they were propositioning me, and obviously I was not going to get into their car with them, but I felt that it was just tragic that, you know, I can't be a woman in their 20s walking around in daylight in London and not feel scared and not feel threatened.
Mike, is this a fair point Daisy is making? This is something that women today in London shouldn't have to put up with?
Of course they shouldn't, but the sexism faced by men is far graver. We have in our consultation document 20 areas where the state assaults men and boys through the state's actions and inactions. And I challenge any one of the three of you to tell me one area where, in Britain today, the state disadvantages women and girls. One. Is
this an issue? Do the state disadvantage women and girls?
Sorry, can I just give one example of that? Domestic violence...
Well, let's let Dina answer the question, then you can make your point.
I mean, well, I think that there's a gender pay gap, and the people who are losing out in the gender pay gap aren't men, they're women. Women are paid less than men. And that is something that starts not when we're in our early 20s, but after motherhood, which seems to me that there is a disadvantage to women, and there is sexism towards women. But I don't think that it's a competition to see who's the most wronged. I think that we live in a sexist society, and it disadvantages men and women because we're expected to conform and, you know, live in this world that's designed for men to basically go out to work and women to stay at home, and it begins to be difficult when we don't live that way.
Absolutely, and Sean might agree that sexism hurts everyone the reason I think we're all here is because we all want to live in a city and a world where men and women have equal opportunities and equal benefits. And I don't think there's anyone who would argue for sexism that harms men ever. I've written about the way certain products are marketed towards men and how that is damaging. You know, I don't deny that doesn't exist, but I do think that, you know, as you know, we've sort of discussed, women on average earn £300,000 in their lifetime less than men do.
Because they go into different lines of work. They don't go into lines of work which have a risk, a premium, if you like.
What do you mean? What lines of work is this where women don't have as much risk as men?
Well, I mean, 126 people died last year in work-related incidents. 2 of them are women. Women do not go into those lines of work. And just to go back to the gender pay gap has been discredited decade after decade. It's all down to different lines of work. But if I can just have one example of everyday sexism, we know that about 40% of victims of domestic violence are men. Yet for every place in a refuge in Britain available for an abused man, there are 180 available for women.
Okay, but I would say to you that domestic violence does affect men and it's a really serious problem, and I would never want to minimise the pain that men are in, but men are not the people who tend to die. So what I would say is that there aren't enough places in refuges for women, there aren't enough places in refuges for men. There's problems with benefits for men and women who have been victims of domestic violence, but, you know, let the places in refuges go to people who are most likely to be killed. And in that case, it is the women who are mostly killed.
That's absurd. That is an absolute lack of sympathy for men.
That's not true.
There's more chance of women being killed under domestic violence.
That's just a simple statistical truth.
That's
so
a
you're
very
saying
small
that
number.
it's
That's
not
a very
sexist
small number.
then, is it?
800,000 men a year face domestic violence.
Yeah, and 2 women die a week.
And there are 15 places for men in refuges in the UK.
And that's awful, and there's a real problem with funding for refuges.
I said earlier on, there are 20 areas in which the state disadvantages men and boys, and the 3 of you haven't come up with one area where it disadvantages women and girls. Seriously, I invite you to come up with one.
Well, I think we talked about the gender pay gap.
The gender pay gap has been discredited for decades.
But I don't think that it has.
I think if you talk about the gender pay gap, I think what you mentioned is very serious. Obviously, nobody wants there to be any deaths in the workplace, but I do think that's a separate issue about safety in the workplace. I also think that you have to look at what happens in schools, the way that women are taught to, or, you know, encouraged to go into certain professions, to take up certain subjects. I don't know the figures off the top of my head, I'm afraid. You do find a lot more young women tend to study the arts and humanities as opposed to scientists. I think we'd love to see a lot more women.
I mean,
and I don't think you can say it's choice.
Daisy, it's got so ridiculous today that female postgraduate engineering students at Brunel earn £15,000 a year additional grant purely because they're women. They don't want to go into that line of work.
That's largely because there's not enough women going into the industry.
What's wrong with that
problem?
Why is no one complaining about this 70% of medical students who are women? That isn't a problem, apparently. So where
do you get all your figures from?
Well, official statistics. They're all available.
Because
they're all on our
quite
website.
interested to find out exactly where you get the figures in terms of men are. There is no gender pay gap.
It has been. Really, I can't believe anyone would come up with that. You know, it has been discredited for 20 years. Women go into different lines of work. There are lines of work they want to go into. So supply exceeds demand, and that it's just, you know.
I'm sorry. The reason I'm laughing is because everything that you're saying is laughable. Like there is a gender pay gap. You might not want it to exist because you clearly don't like women very much.
It exists,
but it does.
It does exist.
Mike, is this a fair point Dina's making? You don't like women very much.
Absolute nonsense.
Because to be fair to Daisy and Dina, they have said that look, there are issues which affect men just as much as women,
which has been discredited. You know, it's perfectly well known that there is a gender pay gap, but it's down to women's choices. Women will not go into things like engineering, and you know.
Okay, but I think that I don't know if you know any women, or I mean,
I do. What a silly statement.
Okay. When women are young, it's a lot of the things that people who are sort of anti-sexism campaigners or people who campaign for women to get more involved with science and technology and engineering and maths say is that they're not incentivised and they're not told when they're young, when they're in school, that they can do these jobs, and that's why there's a lot of work.
Why do they always have to be incentivised? Why do women need role models? I mean, for God's sake, are they adults or are they sheep?
Mike, who are your role models?
Margaret Thatcher.
A woman?
Yes.
So what's your view of Margaret Thatcher?
I think she was the most astonishing political, prime minister of this, peacetime prime minister. for 100 years. A most remarkable woman who got to the top on working working very hard and not expecting, special treatment.
And she put quite a lot of measures in place that really work to keep women out of the workplace, especially single mothers. Does that fit with your credo?
Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense.
What about everyday sexism in terms of everyday in your life, in your working situation? And Dina, what have you experienced there?
I was talking to someone the other day, and I said that I was just talking about the art of getting in a taxi, and I said, obviously, when you get in a taxi, the first thing that the taxi driver says to you is, "Oh, do you have a boyfriend?" And they were like, "Really?" And it was like, "Yeah." I mean, obviously, you don't realise it, but it doesn't happen to men, and you don't have to say to a taxi driver or to a man on the street, who will come. I mean, men approach me on the street a bit, and you don't have to say to them, "Please go away, I have a boyfriend," because. I mean, that is kind of a bit, they sort of just expect you to be interested.
That the only way you can get a man to leave you alone is to essentially say, "I am owned by another man."
Yeah, because he respects the other man more than your decision to say no to
This
him.
is it, Matt. What's your feelings then on this sort of society approach to women and sexism?
I think it's pathetic. I think it's it's just a recipe for whiny women to whine, which is why we call the Everyday Sexism Project the Everyday Whining Project. You actually get stronger in life by meeting challenges. You don't get stronger by expecting the world mysteriously to stop, a few sexist men saying things to you.
I really wish Mike was right. I really wish this is imaginary.
I really wish
that... It's low-level stuff.
I don't think that it's low-level stuff, and I don't think that it's very respectful for you to minimise the experience of loads of women. I mean, there is a problem, just in terms of getting on the tube. The other day, I was getting off the tube and a man reached out and grabbed my breast. I mean, that is not something that should have to happen on tubes. That's inappropriate behaviour, and I shouldn't have to feel bad or sad for a day.
OK, Dina, we've been polling this question all day, talking about everyday sexism. We want to know if you think society is becoming more or less sexist. Get voting, just going to londonlive.co.uk. Let's see how you've been voting so far. And those results are just coming in. OK, now here we go. Now, is society becoming more or less sexist? 42% of you say it's becoming more sexist, whereas 58% of you say it's becoming less, as a matter of fact. And also, just going to look at some messages that you've been sending in. We've got one Facebook message. Right, now, Martin Phillips says, "I think people are more acutely aware of sexism. However, you still don't hear the media much, if anything, about male sexual discrimination takes place." So this is someone agreeing with you here. Mike, Daisy, what do you think about the issues concerning men and boys in regards to sexual discrimination?
Well, as I've mentioned, I've written extensively about it before, especially about mental health. I think something that is very interesting and worth considering is that sort of year on year, sort of tragic things like sort of suicide figures amongst men are up, and there is a perception that it's because men are increasingly isolated and alienated, and they don't have anyone to kind of discuss their struggles with. I think it's interesting that Mike's more or less saying, "Man up," that everyone should just get on with it, because I think if there is a problem with sexism out there that and men feel overwhelmed. If I was a guy right now and I was confronted with so many examples of men being terrible and men's sexist behaviour, I feel really frightened and isolated. And I think it's great to discuss this. I think the more we can talk about it, the more we can, address sort of those mental health issues across the board.
I mean, this is quite an interesting point in regards to the issues and the mental health issues men have to deal with. Is that something created by men? It's not something you could say would be created by women.
No, I mean,
in terms of why they can't talk, why they can't talk about their emotions, express themselves.
Again, when people talk about male suicides, and it's because they can't talk about their emotions, I think that's kicking a dead man, quite frankly. Some months ago, I did a piece on homelessness, which is overwhelmingly a male problem. And a social worker wrote in to say, she emailed me to say that she works that she works with the homeless, and if a homeless woman comes to her on a Friday, she has to give her clothes, money, food, and accommodation. If a man comes in on a Friday, he's sent back out on the street with nothing. I mean, are we really surprised that today, for every woman who commits suicide, 3.5 men will?
Mike, we really need to talk about where you get these figures from. Okay,
they're
Dina,
all official. They're all government figures.
It is true that more young men commit suicide than women, and it's also a real issue that men are more likely to have more progressed cancers because they won't go to the doctor and they won't present their symptoms. I mean, those are really big problems. And I think that, in a way, men are the victims of our society, where we expect men to be silent and to man up and to not say what's wrong with them and to not talk about their emotions, and for women to be more expressive.
I lost count of the number of adverts you see where, you know,
I'm
it's like the
so,
men being...
so sorry. Daisy, Dina, Mike, thank you so much. You've got to end it there. Although, if you want to still get involved in that, just go to our Twitter page @LondonLive, #HeadlineLondon, or indeed vote in our poll at londonlive.co.uk.